I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome everybody. Welcome members and staff in attendance to this meeting of the Standing Committee on Alberta's Economic Future. My name is Nathan Neudorf and I'm the MLA for Lethbridge East and the chair of this committee. I'd ask that members and those joining the committee at the table introduce themselves for the record, starting to my right with the Deputy Chair.
Good morning, Darren Billis, MLA, Edmonton, Beverly, Clairview.
Garth Roswell, MLA, Vermilion, Lloydminster, Wainwright.
Good morning, Jordan Walker, MLA, Sherwood Park.
Miranda Rosen, MLA for Banff Kananaskis.
Morning, Heather Sweet, MLA, Edmonton Manning.
Good morning, Nancy Robert, Clerk of Journals and Committees.
Good morning, Aaron Roth, Committee Clerk.
And I will just call those online and ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Reid.
Good morning, Roger Reid, MLA.
Ms. Armstrong-Homnick.
Jackie Armstrong-Homnick, MLA for Saskatchewan.
Mr. Barnes.
Drew Barnes, MLA, Cypress Medicine Hat. Good morning.
Member Irwin.
Janice Irwin, Edmonton Highlands, Norwood.
Mr. Van Dyken.
Glenn Van Dyken, MLA for Athabasca, Barhead, and Westlock.
And Mr. Loyola.
Good morning, everyone. Rod Loyola, MLA for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Thank you. I would like to note for the record the following substitutions: Mr. Billis substituting as Deputy Chair and Mr. Loyola for Ms. Goring. A few housekeeping items to address before we turn to the business at hand. I would note for members that masks should be worn in the committee room except when you are speaking, and members are also encouraged to leave an appropriate amount of physical distance around the table. Please note that the microphones are operated by the Hansard staff. Committee proceedings are live streamed on the internet and broadcast on Alberta Assembly TV. The audio and video stream and transcripts of meetings can be accessed via the Legislative Assembly website. Those participating by video conference are asked to please turn on your camera while speaking and mute your microphone when not speaking. Members participating virtually who wish to be placed on the speakers list are asked to email or send a message in the group chat to the committee clerk, and members in the room are asked to please signal the chair. Please set your cell phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. Please be advised, too, that all committee room public galleries are closed. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Can I receive a motion to approve the agenda? Seeing Ms. Sweet. Move that the agenda for the October 21st, 2021 meeting of the Standing Committee or Alberta's Economic Future be adopted or as distributed. Any comments on that? Seeing none in the room, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Online, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Anyone online opposed, please say no. Hearing none, that motion is carried. Next item, approval of minutes, September 13th, 2021. We have the minutes from the September 13th, 2021 meeting of the committee. Are there any errors or omissions to note? Seeing none, would a member please move that? Mr. Roswell. So, Mr. Roswell moved that the minutes of the September 13th, 2021 meeting of the Standing Committee on Alberta's Economic Future be adopted as circulated. Any comments? Seeing none, those in the room, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Online, all those approved, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say no. That motion is carried. Item 4, review of the Lobbyists Act, technical briefings. Honourable members, at our September 13th, 2021 meeting, the committee invited both the Ministry of Justice and the Solicitor General and the offices of the Ethics Commissioner and Lobbyist Registrar to provide a technical briefing to the committee as part of the committee's review of the Lobbyists Act. We have with us today officials from both offices. At this time, I would like to invite Ms. Joan Neatby, Barrister and Solicitor, Legislative Reform, and the Ministry of Justice and the Solicitor General to make a presentation to the committee, which will be followed by a period for questions by the committee members. Ms. Neatby, you have 20 minutes to make your presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to provide—
Excuse me, Ms. Neatby. Can I ask all members to please mute themselves? Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Neatby, please begin again.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to provide a technical Briefing on the Lobbyist Act. The Lobbyist Act is a challenging piece of legislation. Gaining a comprehensive understanding of this legislation and how all of its elements work together requires some effort and may take time. I'm here today to help give you a head start. My intent is to provide you with a high-level understanding of Alberta's Act and how it fits within the Canadian context. First, I would like to provide you with some historical background. In 1996, the Conflicts of Interest Act Review Panel, chaired by Dr. Alan Tupper, recommended that Alberta adopt lobbyist registration. There was no movement on lobbyist registration in 2006 when the governing party came under new leadership. An all-party committee conducted a review of the Conflicts of Interest Act and recommended that government establish a lobbyist registry. Bill 1, the Lobbyist Act, was introduced and subsequently referred to a policy field committee for further review. This committee sought input from stakeholders, and the bill was amended and passed in December 2007. The Lobbyist Act and regulations came into force on September 28, 2010, and the Lobbyist Registry was fully operational on that date as well. I understand that Ms. Draper, the Lobbyist Registrar and General Counsel, will offer you a more comprehensive information about the Lobbyist Act and the Lobbyist Registry. I would like to help impart a high-level understanding of how Alberta's Lobbyist Act fits within the Canadian context. Alberta's legislation was formed from the same basic principles as lobbying legislation in other Canadian jurisdictions. The first principle of this legislation is that lobbying government is a legitimate activity. The Lobbyist Act and Lobbyist Registry are not aimed at prohibiting or limiting lobbying. Stakeholders, organizations, and businesses have the right to communicate with decision makers and to provide decision makers with information that highlights their views. There is an expectation that people will attempt to influence government decisions. This is part of democracy. The second principle of lobbying legislation is that lobbying activity must be transparent. It is important that people know who is lobbying, who is being lobbied, and the subject matter of the lobbying activity. Ultimately, this form of open communication is aimed at increasing the quality of public policy making and ensuring that decisions are being made for the greater good. In order to achieve this increased transparency and accountability, lobbying legislation in Canada focuses primarily on the registration of lobbyists. Canadian jurisdictions have established registries to provide public access to information about lobbying activities. Earlier, I mentioned that there are several elements to lobbying legislation. It is necessary to gain an understanding of each of these elements in order to understand how the legislation works. The Act outlines who is a lobbyist and what activity is considered to be lobbying. Only those who are paid to lobby are required to register. Lobbyists are those who are paid to communicate with public office holders in an attempt to influence certain types of decisions made by government and prescribed provincial entities. There are two types of lobbyists: those who are hired by a client to lobby and those who lobby on behalf of their organization. Lobbyists who are paid by a client are called consultant lobbyists. In Alberta, those who lobby on behalf of their organization are called organization lobbyists. However, some jurisdictions have different terminology. For example, most jurisdictions use the term in-house lobbyist to refer to individuals who lobby on behalf of an organization. An organization could be a business, trade, industry, or professional organization. It could be a union or a chamber of commerce. It could be a nonprofit organization or an interest group. An organization could be incorporated, unincorporated, a partnership, or a sole proprietorship. Canadian lobbying legislation requires that lobbyists file returns that include information about their lobbying activity. The rules differ for when consultant lobbyists and organization lobbyists are required to file a return. In Alberta, a consultant lobbyist is required to file a return in respect of each undertaking to lobby, not later than 10 days after entering into the undertaking. Also in Alberta, a person who lobbies on behalf of an organization is not considered to be a lobbyist until they, together with their other persons in the organization, lobby or have a duty to lobby at least 50 hours annually. The designated filer of an organization that has an organization lobbyist shall file a return within 2 months after the day on which the individual in that organization becomes an organization lobbyist, and within 30 days after the expiration of each 6-month period thereafter. Some jurisdictions, including Alberta, require consultant lobbyists to report when they set up meetings with public office holders or when they attempt to influence the awarding of a contract. In addition, Alberta requires consultant lobbyists to report when they communicate with a public office holder in the attempt to influence the awarding of a contract. Other common features of lobbying legislation. All Canadian lobbying legislation uses the term public office holders to identify those who are the targets of lobbying activity for decision makers. While there are differences between jurisdictions as to who is a public office holder, the legislation applies only when lobbying activity is directed at a public office holder. In Alberta, a public office holder includes members of the Legislative Assembly and their staff, members of Cabinet and their staff, individuals appointed to government boards and committees, and employees, officers, and directors of government departments and public agencies. Furthermore, most Canadian jurisdictions have adopted the concept that lobbying includes an attempt to influence. However, the federal government requires reporting of all communications with public office holders, whether or not there's an attempt to influence. The most common examples of lobbying are attempts to influence decisions about lobbying and the formation or alteration of government policies and programs. Not all communications with public office holders must be reported. For example, an individual making a submission to a public office holder on behalf of an organization concerning the enforcement of any act or regulation with respect to that organization is not considered to be a lobbyist. This is a common exception to the application of lobbying legislation in Canada. In contrast, pardon me, an individual paid to make a submission to a public office holder on behalf of an organization concerning the development of legislation governing that organization would be considered a lobbyist. This rule is common to all lobbying legislation in Canada. In addition, not all individuals who are paid to communicate in an attempt to influence are required to register. For example, people from various levels of government can communicate with each other and attempt to influence each other's decisions. They will not be required to register as a lobbyist, provided that they are acting in their official capacity. In Canada, this is a common exception to the requirement to register as a lobbyist. As I mentioned before, my understanding is that Ms. Draper will address the features of Alberta's Lobbyist Act in more detail in her presentation. However, I would like to highlight 2 key features of Alberta's legislation. Alberta was one of the first jurisdictions to adopt a prohibition against a dual role. Lobbyists are prohibited from lobbying government and providing paid advice to government on the same subject matter. For example, if a consultant is being paid to give government advice on drug program policies, they cannot also be hired as a lobbyist to influence the Minister of Health to include a particular drug on the drug benefit list. When it was first adopted, the prohibition meant that an individual could not lobby government and provide paid advice to government on the same subject matter at the same time. This prohibition was expanded so an individual must choose to either lobby government or provide paid advice to government. An individual is prohibited from performing both roles, even in respect of different subject matters. In addition, an individual cannot lobby government if their associate holds a contract to provide paid advice to government on the same subject matter. Also, an individual cannot enter into a contract to provide advice to government if their associate lobbies government on the same subject matter. While lobbying legislation across Canada contains offence and penalty provisions to aid enforcement, Alberta has taken it one step further. In Alberta, the Ethics Commissioner has authority to impose administrative penalties. This enhances enforcement of the Act, as there are situations in which administrative penalties may be more effective than the offence and penalty provisions. Of course, as you proceed with your review, you will gain an understanding of the different elements of the Act and how they are interrelated. As you consider what recommendations to make for amendments to the Act, it will be critical to consider the impact that each change may have on the other elements of the Act. In addition, when considering legislation from other jurisdictions, it is important to understand that all the elements of their legislation also work together. As I am sure that you are aware, it will require time and effort to understand just what everything means and how it all operates. As an official with Alberta Justice and Solicitor General, I am happy to assist this committee by providing technical support as requested. In closing, I would like to mention that maintaining an appropriate balance is a key consideration when considering potential amendments to the Lobbyist Act. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, lobbying is a legitimate activity, and it can be very valuable to government during the decision-making process. In other words, the legislation is not meant to constrain anyone's communication with public officials. On the contrary, communication with government is necessary in a democracy. At the same time, it is important that lobbying activity is transparent. Ultimately, the aim of the Lobbyist Act and Lobbyist Registry is to strike a balance between facilitating this kind of openness and transparency without unduly deterring or preventing lobbying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Neatby. I would now like to open the floor for members of the committee to ask questions in relation to Ms. Neatby's presentation for up to the next 30 minutes. Do we have any questions? I see MLA Loyola. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it, you recognizing me. I remember that when we were reviewing this last, there was some issues around what is considered quote unquote a meeting. So I was hoping that you could go into a little bit more detail about what actually constitutes a meeting, because as we know that sometimes there's public events that are being held around the city or in different parts of the province, and lobbyists take these opportunities to actually meet with government officials, with ministers and whatnot. And would something in that vein be considered meeting with a public office holder?
Thank you for that question. One thing I would like to mention is that as an official with Justice, I do have knowledge about the Act and how it is drafted, but I am not in a position to provide you advice with how it's interpreted. So the Ethics Commissioner, pardon me, and the Lobbyist Registrar are responsible for interpretation and administration. So I'm wondering whether Ms. Tressler or Ms. Draper would like to respond to your question, Mr. Loyola.
Mr. Loyola, do you have a supplemental?
Well, if we could have either Commissioner Tressler or someone else respond to that, that would be great.
Sorry, the Ethics Commissioner will be presenting next, and there should be the opportunity to ask that question again, so I would anticipate that will be addressed. Thank you. Ms. Sweet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm curious about some of the comments that you've made around, as we review the Lobbyist Act, ensuring that we're looking at how it impacts the other pieces of legislation that it also interacts with. So I'm just wondering if maybe you could highlight some of those other pieces of legislation that we should be also ensuring that we're cognizant or aware of. But then also specifically around the Conflict of Interest Act and how you see the Lobbyist Act interfacing with the Conflict of Interest Act.
Thank you for that question, Ms. Sweet. My intention was to refer to elements of this act, the Lobbyist Act, and how they interrelate. This act talks about who it applies to and who it doesn't apply to, communications it applies to and communications it doesn't apply to. So my point was developing a full understanding of the Lobbyist Act and how it interrelates is important when considering which recommendations you would like to make for amendment. But it's a very good point. There is definitely an interrelationship between the Lobbyist Act and the Conflicts of Interest Act. More so now than there used to be, in part because who is a public agent or which entities are public agencies refers you back to the Conflicts of Interest Act Part 4.3. So yes, it is important to understand that part of the Conflicts of Interest Act. Also, it's interesting to note that Alberta's prohibition against a dual role is in essence a rule against a conflict of interest.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Do you have any thoughts then of key areas that we should be reviewing to make sure that, you know, we are, if changes were to be made, that there were key things that we're looking at that could have impacts? Or I'm not sure if I'm asking this question correctly, but do you have any?
Well, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's within the committee's purview and not mine to consider what areas you would like to review for potential recommendations to amendment for the Act. If I were involved as a committee member, I would look at things like the scope of application of the Act. So does the Act apply to the people that you want it to apply to? Does it apply to the types of communications you want it to apply to? Are the exemptions outlined in the Act appropriate? Do they need further review? Are there any adjustments? Those are the sorts of things that I would look at if I were a member of the committee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roswell.
Yeah, it's just usually when you're reviewing something, you're trying to fix a problem that is there or not. Are there areas that you, within the Act, that you think create problems for elected members or problems for lobbyists that we should be focusing on, that you can make us aware of and we can zero in on them?
Thank you for that question. I think that is a question more for the Ethics Commissioner and the Lobbyist Register and General Counsel, as they are responsible for administration and interpretation of the legislation. From my perspective as an official with justice, there may be a need to sort of take a step back and look at some more of the technical drafting things. You know, it's always a good idea to look at a piece of legislation and see if it needs to be refreshed a little bit to make it easier for people who need to understand it. So, for example, there are many lobbyists in Alberta, and my question would be, is this legislation easily understandable? Are there ways that we could make it easier for them to understand their obligations? Having said that, it's also important that the legislation be clear, and sometimes those two goals can be in a bit of conflict.
Thank you. Mr. Roswell, do you have a supplement?
Oh, that's good. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Armstrong-Hominiuk.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I was wondering if there's a designation for an unpaid lobbyist, and are they subject to the same regulations as everyone else?
So under this legislation, only lobbyists who are paid to lobby are required to register. So in fact, it's sort of a misnomer to talk about somebody else who's trying to influence a government decision. It's sort of a misnomer to call them a lobbyist. Basically, they would be people with an interest who are trying to influence government decision makers or decision makers with prescribed provincial entities. And the Act lists a number of different decisions that an Albertan can attempt to influence without requiring registration.
Thank you. Ms. Armstrong-Hominiuk, do you have any further supplemental?
No, that's fine.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walker.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for this wonderful, very informative presentation. So I'm a comparativist by nature. I'm always thinking in those sorts of terms, comparing dichotomies, all of that. And so you had touched on it briefly, talking about how Alberta's Lobbyist Act stacks up with other Canadian jurisdictions. Could you expand on that a little bit? I would just like to know maybe where Alberta is a bit unique, if possible, as regards this legislation, and where we're similar. And I mean, is there any other provinces, as we review this very important act, that we could look to that might have some best practices we may want to consider? I believe in Albertan exceptionalism. We're the best province in Canada, but I'm sure we can learn from some of our provincial peers. Thanks so much.
Okay, now I understand that one of the tasks that will be undertaken as staff is supporting this committee in its review will be a jurisdictional comparison. So some of my knowledge on this may be a bit out of date, and we'd be well served by refreshing our jurisdictional comparison. Some of the things that jump to my mind, though, in terms of comparison are that the obligations for registration under the Federal Act are more strenuous than those in Alberta. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily better. I think that's something for the committee to consider and to hear from stakeholders on. Alberta is a bit unique in the two aspects that I'd spoken about, which are the Ethics Commissioner and Lobbyist Registrar's ability to impose administrative penalties. Alberta does have other legislation where there's ability to impose administrative penalties. In some instances, other jurisdictions have followed that, and they also have it in general. My knowledge about whether other lobbying legislation in Canada has adopted that is not up to date, I'm afraid. That's something that we'll look into. The other somewhat unique aspect is the prohibition against a dual role, although I believe that Quebec has something similar, and jurisdictions that have adopted codes of conduct may also have similar provisions. Again, that is something that we should refresh our knowledge of when we look at legislation from other jurisdictions.
Mr. Walker, do you have a supplemental?
No, thanks so much. That was excellent.
Any other members wishing to ask any questions at this time? Seeing none, I would like to thank you, Ms. Neatme, for your presentation and for answering questions from the committee members today. I would ask that sorry, I apologize. My notes include additional remarks that aren't required. And we appreciate your time. You're welcome to stay and observe or leave the meeting at this time. Thank you for your cooperation. I would now like to call upon the Honourable Marguerite Tressler, Ethics Commissioner, and Ms. Laura Draper, Lobbyist, Registrar, and General Counsel, to make a presentation to the committee. Ms. Tressler and Ms. Draper, you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
I'll start, and then I'm going to turn the matter over to Ms. Draper. So thank you for inviting us to take part in this technical briefing. And I want to provide some very brief political background to lobbying legislation in Canada. For the most part, this type of legislation has been enacted in reaction to scandal or crisis of some sort. The result is that the legislation has tended, with some exceptions, to be the bare minimum. The situation was different in Alberta. Former Premier Stelmach, when he was running to be leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, had lobbying legislation as part of his platform. And when he was elected, he wanted to implement it. He did face some resistance from within his cabinet and elsewhere, and many compromises were made to get a consensus. Compromises do not often work well in legislation. So as a result, there are areas within the Alberta legislation that could work better. The main thing I would ask you to bear in mind as you review this piece of legislation is that public transparency needs to be paramount. So I'm now going to ask the Lobbyist Registrar, Ms. Draper, to give you an overview of the Lobbyist Act.
Good morning. Thank you to the committee for inviting us today. As has been mentioned, my name is Laura Draper. I am the Alberta Lobbyist Registrar as well as the General Counsel at the Ethics Commissioner's Office. And I've been in those roles for over 4 years. I'm not sure if you can see there. I can't see it all if you have the PowerPoint before you. Aaron, is that up?
We are just having a technical issue that's unfortunately it's thinking, the computer's thinking. We'll hopefully get it up shortly.
It's also posted on the committee's
Okay,
It is. Yeah, sorry, one more thing, Ms. Draper. It is posted on the committee's internal website. If anybody has their technology able to bring that up, that would be helpful. And that way, Ms. Draper, you can proceed.
Okay, I'll just proceed as if it's not visible, but if you have it, great. So as Lobbyist Registrar, I am responsible for administering the Alberta Lobbyist Registry, enforcing compliance with the Lobbyists Act, and educating lobbyists and the public about the Lobbyists Act. And today I'm going to give a very brief introductory overview of the regulatory regime that's set out in the Lobbyists Act and its corresponding regulation and ministerial order for those who are paid to lobby Alberta public office holders. Now, because of the limited time we have, this presentation, of course, cannot cover everything there is to know about the subject matter. So I also have prepared a handout for the committee that sets out more detailed information for members to review at their convenience after the presentation today. And I will send that to Aaron Roth after the meeting for distribution to members. But keep in mind that even the handout is an introductory overview of the subject and can't cover everything either. So if you have a PowerPoint, next slide, please. Now, in general, the Alberta Lobbyists Act regime recognizes that lobbying is a legitimate and an important activity in a democratic society. But it aims to protect the public interest by balancing that free and open access to government with public transparency and accountability as to who is being paid to try to influence government, as well as with a few restrictions on what those people can do in order to prevent conflicts of interest. So keep in mind that individuals who engage in a particular profession or activity often are subject to regulatory requirements in order to protect the public interest, and that is normal across a broad range of legitimate professions and activities. Lobbying is no different. If an individual makes the choice to be paid to lobby, or an organization makes the choice to pay someone to lobby on its behalf, then there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But they need to understand that they're going to have to respect and comply with the Lobbyists Act requirements that aim to protect the public interest. Next slide, if anyone has it. So what is lobbying? The full definition of lobbying is in the handout that committee members will be receiving, but in a nutshell, it's communicating with a public office holder to try to influence their decisions, and in particular, their decisions about the content or existence of legislation, policies, programs, guidelines, and directives, the awarding of funding, and the privatization or sale of the provision of goods and services to government. Now, there are three key points to briefly highlight here about the definition of lobby, and more details about these points are in the handout. So first, the definition of lobby requires there to be a communication with one or more public office holders, whether that be by direct communication, by grassroots communication, or for consultant lobbyists only, by arranging a meeting. And the second point to highlight is that, except for in the case of a consultant lobbyist arranging a meeting, the definition requires that the communication involve an attempt to influence public office holders' decisions about certain matters. And the last point to highlight here is that the definition of lobbying is broader for consultant lobbying. About those two types of lobbyists in a moment. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, the definition of lobby requires there to be a communication with one or more public office holders. Now, who is a public office holder? The full definition is on the slide, and more details, of course, are in the handout. But put briefly, public office holders include Alberta MLAs and their staff, Alberta cabinet members and their staff, and employees and members of the Alberta government and of many Alberta agencies, boards, and commissions. Next slide, if you're following. Now, not everyone who does the action of lobbying necessarily is going to meet the definition of a lobbyist under the Act. There are two types of lobbyists under the Act: consultant lobbyists and organization lobbyists. And the requirements and restrictions in the Act differ in some respects depending on which type of lobbyist someone is. So a consultant lobbyist is a person who, for payment, undertakes to lobby on behalf of another individual or organization other than their own organization or the organization that employs them. So in other words, it's a person who's been engaged to lobby on behalf of a client in exchange for payment. And an organization lobbyist is a paid employee, paid officer, paid director, partner, or sole proprietor of an organization who lobbies or has a duty to lobby on behalf of that organization, and who collectively with everyone else in the organization meets the 50-hour annual organization lobbyist threshold. So these are the paid in-house personnel who lobby or have a duty to lobby on behalf of their own organization or the organization that employs them. But as you can see, simply because an individual lobbies on behalf of their own organization or their employer does not necessarily mean that they meet the definition of organization lobbyist. The 50-hour annual threshold for organization lobbyists also has to be met to fall within that definition. Next slide. So the slide and the handout explain this threshold in more detail, but in short, the 50-hour annual organization lobbyist threshold will be met by an organization if the cumulative or collective amount of time that any one or more of the paid in-house personnel of the organization have spent lobbying and preparing to lobby, or have a duty to spend lobbying and preparing to lobby on behalf of the organization is 50 hours or more in a year. Now, some key practical issues to note here are that organizations can outsource preparation time in order to avoid meeting the threshold. It is difficult for this office to independently determine how much time an organization spent preparing to lobby. And the amount of time spent on lobbying does not necessarily correlate to the level of access or influence achieved by the organization. Next slide, please. So communications in certain specific circumstances are expressly exempt from the application of the Lobbyists Act, and certain types of individuals are expressly exempt from the application of the Act for things that they do when they're acting in their official capacity. And it's not possible to address all the exemptions in a brief introductory overview. So instead, this presentation and the handout highlight two of them that are most notable. And the first is the exemption for unpaid volunteers. So volunteers who do not receive any payment for their services are exempt from the application of the Act and are not considered to be lobbyists, even if they lobby. And the second is the exemption for in-house personnel of many nonprofit organizations. So there is an exemption in the Act for the directors, officers, and employees of nonprofit organizations, one, that are not established to serve management, union, or professional interests, and two, that do not have a majority of members that are profit-seeking enterprises or representatives of profit-seeking enterprises. And those individuals are not subject to the Act when they're acting in their official capacity as a director, officer, or employee of that type of nonprofit organization. And so they don't need to register as lobbyists for any lobbying that they do on behalf of their nonprofit organization in that official capacity. So an issue to highlight here is that although this exemption does not capture organizations like unions or professional associations or business or industry associations, it does capture a broad scope of organizations that are nonprofit, which can include organizations that lobby about special interest issues. And those organizations currently can avoid publicly registering their lobbying because of this exemption. Next slide, please. So the way in which the Act seeks to have public transparency and accountability about lobbying by lobbyists in Alberta is by establishing a public registry in which lobbyists must disclose their lobbying through registration. And in practice, the Alberta Lobbyist Registry is the online registration system that lobbyists must use to publicly register their lobbying in compliance with the registration requirements in the Act. And it is free to register in the registry. It's also free to search the registry. All registrations are searchable and viewable by any member of the public with an internet connection, free of charge at any time and without the need to create an account or a password. Next slide, please. So what are the registration requirements for lobbyists? Again, more details are in the handout, but put briefly, the registration requirements in the Lobbyists Act are as follows. Consultant lobbyists must file one registration per client within 10 days of the date that they entered into the client engagement. Then they must keep their filed registrations up to date by filing updates within 30 days of any changes. And they must terminate a filed registration within 30 days of the end of the relevant client engagement. And organization lobbyists must file one registration that covers all the in-house lobbyists in the organization within 2 months of the date that the organization met the 50-hour threshold. Then the organization must keep its registration up to date by filing updates within 30 days of any changes and by filing renewals twice a year. And also, if the organization ever were to stop being required to register, then it would need to terminate its registration within 30 days. So something to note about the filing requirements for both consultant lobbyists and organization lobbyists is that, unlike in some other Canadian jurisdictions, like at the Canadian federal level, there currently is no requirement in the Alberta Lobbyists Act to file a report that specifically sets out meetings held with senior public office holders, such as members, ministers, ministerial staff, deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers, and chief executives of public agencies. In Alberta, as long as a lobbyist registration for the relevant client or organization is active, up to date, and generally covers the subject matters addressed, communication techniques used, and public office holders lobbied, the lobbyist can rely on that one registration to broadly cover all of its lobbying meetings and communications for the client or the organization during the entire time period covered by the registration. However, this does mean that there is less public transparency and accountability about who's being paid to meet with and influence senior public office holders in Alberta than in some other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So what information needs to be included in a lobbyist registration? The information that consultant lobbyists and organization lobbyists must disclose in their registrations is set out in Schedules 1 and 2 of the Lobbyists Act. And because of time constraints today, I can't discuss all the requirements in any detail, but I have provided more information about them in the handout. Put very briefly, the required information includes information about the client in the case of consultant lobbyists, or the organization in the case of organization lobbyists. And it also includes information about the individual lobbyists, such as their first and last names and whether they have breached any prohibitions in the Act, and also about the lobbying activities. And an important item to highlight here is that there is no requirement to disclose the names of any individual public office holders lobbied. Rather, lobbyists currently only need to identify the government departments and provincial entities lobbied, and then check off a box to generally indicate whether or not they lobby any MLAs, any members of the Executive Council, or any of their staff. Hence why the current lack of a requirement for lobbyists to specifically register meetings with senior public office holders is particularly notable when we are thinking about public transparency. Next slide, please. So in addition to the registration filing obligations, the Lobbyists Act also includes a few restrictions on what lobbyists can do, and that's in order to prevent conflicts of interest. And in the interest of time, I'm going to note these restrictions only very briefly, but again, more information about them is in the handout. So Section 6.1 of the Act prohibits consultant lobbyists from receiving any payment that is in whole or in part contingent on their degree of success in lobbying. And Section 2 of the Act prohibits both consultant lobbyists and organization lobbyists from giving or promising a gift, favor, or benefit to a public office holder being or intended to be lobbied. One, that the public office holder is not allowed to accept, or two, that if given, would place the public office holder in a conflict of interest. And overall, Section 6.2 is difficult for lobbyists to comply with, which makes it more challenging to administer and enforce as well. It is highly contextual, and what's acceptable can differ significantly depending on the particular public office holder and the particular situation, as different public office holders will be subject to different gift restrictions and circumstances. So for example, each public agency, board, and commission has its own code of conduct that sets out the gift restrictions that apply to its own board members and employees. And those restrictions can differ considerably across agencies. And then finally, there are the contracting prohibitions in Section 6 of the Act, which Ms. Neatby talked about more. They basically aim to prevent conflicts of interest from arising because the same or related persons are being paid to influence public office holders at the same time that they're being paid to advise public office holders. Next slide, please. So although I take a proactive approach as registrar to compliance in order to try to reduce the amount of enforcement action required, the lobbyist registrar and the ethics commissioner do have enforcement powers available to promote compliance with the Act. These enforcement powers are noted briefly on the slide, and they're set out in more detail in the handout. We don't have time to go through them now, but I do want to highlight one issue before we wrap up, and that is that an investigation under Section 15 in the Act results in an investigative report that's tabled by the Speaker in the Legislative Assembly. However, most actual or potential breaches of the Act in practice are too minor to warrant a full investigation that ends with a report tabled in the Assembly. Typically, if it looks like there might be a breach, then I would make preliminary inquiries and requests for information or documents. And that usually is sufficient to determine that there was in fact no breach, or if there was a breach, a written warning and or an administrative penalty, along with a direction to do the appropriate corrective action, such as file the outstanding registration or retract a prohibited gift offer, usually together is sufficient to address it and promote compliance. So it would be helpful in those cases for the registrar to have the power to compel information or documents where necessary to determine if there was a breach, and also what enforcement action is appropriate to promote compliance in the circumstances, without having to commence a full Section 15 investigation resulting in a report tabled in the Assembly. But currently the Act does not provide for that. Next slide, please. So that's it for the formal presentation. As I mentioned, I have a handout for committee members that provides a more detailed introductory overview than we had time for today, and I'll be sending that to Aaron Roth for distribution to members following this meeting. But otherwise, I am happy to answer any questions now as well.
Thank you, Ms. Draper and Ms. Tressler, for your comments. Very much appreciated. I would now like to open the floor for members of the committee to ask questions in relation to this presentation. The committee has up to 30 minutes for these questions. I do have a list. I will start again with Mr. Loyola.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Ms. Draper for, although it's a very summarized presentation, you managed to hit on a lot of issues. Specifically around enforcement. So this question goes to Commissioner Tressler, which is, and in terms of, we already mentioned it was about the interpretation of the Act and issues related around that. Now, previously I asked a question about meetings and what constitutes a meeting. However, I believe that Ms. Draper managed to shed some light on that. So to you, Commissioner Tressler, when you're actually looking at implementing and enforcement, what are some of the things that you would like to see changed in the Act?
I think Ms. Draper, because she does the enforcement, would be in a better position to answer that question.
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you. To Ms. Draper then.
Thank you. I think my last point in the enforcement powers section would be my number one issue that I think is kind of lacking in the current legislation. As I mentioned, in practice, a lot of the non-compliance is relatively minor, missing a filing deadline by a few months by accident because they genuinely didn't know they had to register or something like that. It would be good in those situations to not have to, in order to request documents or information, to not have to commence a full investigation that's going to go to a report in the Assembly for just something as minor as that. So that would be an issue that I think is lacking currently.
And if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, follow-up supplemental. So at the very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that our act doesn't lend itself to as much transparency compared to other jurisdictions. Can you speak specifically to that once again, in terms of how you think now I imagine that would have to do with the fact that senior public officials, lobbyists don't have to register the hours that are, well, they don't have to identify time meeting with them, or can you further elaborate on that to give us a better understanding of what you meant by not as transparent as some other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so our office will at the appropriate time be providing a full written brief with recommendations for areas of improvement or in the act, but that specific comment was about the lack of a meeting registry. So currently the Alberta legislation does not have any requirement to specifically file reports that disclose meetings held with senior public office holders in Alberta versus some of the jurisdictions like at the Canadian federal level. And also I believe BC recently implemented a similar requirement in their amendments to their legislation last year. So that comment was specifically about that. As I mentioned in the presentation, currently in a lobbyist registration, lobbyists just need to identify the government department lobbied, as well as any prescribed provincial entities lobbied, and then just check a box to generally indicate, do they lobby any MLAs, any members of executive council, or any of their staff. So specifically about that requirement, that or that lack of requirement that I was mentioning in my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Draper.
Thank you. Mr. Billis.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Draper. I think you answered I had this similar question. So when you just talked about how lobbyists only have to indicate which department, my next question was a comparative analysis. So, you know, which jurisdictions across the country do they have to indicate which senior officials by title or by name? And so I think you said BC and the federal government. Are there any other jurisdictions that have to indicate when they have specific meetings, not just the department, but which senior officials?
I believe I'm most intimately familiar with the Alberta legislation, as that's the one I actually administer day to day. I think, as Ms. Neatby said, there will be an opportunity at some point for a more in-depth comparative analysis across other jurisdictions, and that might be a better time to get into the nitty-gritty there. But I do believe, even if it's not specifically a meeting registry, there are other jurisdictions, kind of just off the cuff in Canada, that do require names or position titles of the individual public office holders they're lobbying. But I don't have all the information for that kind of in-depth analysis at this point.
Thank you. Any supplemental, Mr. Billis? Thank you. Mr. Roswell.
You had mentioned that organizations can outsource their preparation time. Is that a common practice, and what challenges does that present for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure how common it is, but it is something I have seen from time to time. So basically, the issue there is that there is a loophole in the current Lobbyists Act whereby an organization could engage an outside consultant to do all of the preparation for the organization's in-house lobbying, or at least a lot of the preparation. And then the outside consultant's preparation time is not counted towards the organization, their threshold. And the organization itself might not meet the threshold through the actual lobbying time of its in-house personnel alone. So the organization might not have to register because it's taking a lot of that time out and outsourcing it to someone whose time isn't counted towards the lobbying threshold for that organization. And then meanwhile, the outside consultant itself also doesn't need to register as a lobbyist either, because it only has been engaged to do the preparations and not to actually lobby.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roswell, do you have a supplemental?
Yeah, so I imagine everyone's getting paid in the interim, like even the outside person for doing the prep work. And that gets billed to someone eventually. So it's, you know, like, is that a problem? Because the dollar amount may not be known, or well, I guess the biggest thing is the time, because the time's not counted towards making them having to register is the biggest issue, as opposed to the dollar amount that I guess is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. So the Lobbyist Act actually doesn't take into account how much someone is being paid to lobby. The issue is if someone's being paid at all to lobby, then that's what could bring them under the scope of the legislation. But so how much someone is being paid currently is not relevant under the current legislation. But the issue there, as you pointed out, yes, is that the threshold counts both time spent lobbying and time spent preparing to lobby. And if an organization kind of outsources a chunk of that work, all the prep time, then it's going to either help them avoid or make it a lot less likely for them to meet the threshold that will trigger them to have to register.
Thank you very much for that. Any other members wishing to ask questions at this time? One more call online just to make sure. Seeing none, I would like to thank Ms. Tressler and Ms. Draper for their presentations today and for answering the questions from the committee members. I believe that was fairly comprehensive and helpful for our further deliberations. Please feel free to observe the rest of the meeting or sign off as your schedule dictates. We will now move ahead with the committee with decision items. The first item on that list is the stakeholders list. Honorable members, at our September 13th, 2021 meeting, the committee directed Legislative Assembly Office Research Services to prepare a draft stakeholders list for the committee's consideration at today's meeting. The draft stakeholders list was provided to the committee members at the beginning of October, and it was posted to the committee's internal website. At this time, I would like to ask Dr. Sarah Amato with the LAO Research Services to provide an overview of the document.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, we can.
I'm just going to provide an overview of the draft stakeholders list, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it. So on the draft stakeholders list, you'll notice that there are roughly 7 headings. Those include the lobbyists that are currently registered on the Lobbyist Registry. That's approximately 500 lobbyists. Municipal organizations, advocacy groups, ethics associations, and research institutions, academics, volunteer service organizations, members of the Legislative Assembly as public office holders, and the Office of the Ethics Commissioner and Lobbyist Registrar. I'll also note that, generally speaking, just some comments on how we came up with this list of suggestions. These are individuals and organizations who have participated mainly in previous reviews of this act and or were discussed in previous reviews of this act. As was noted, this is a draft list of suggestions. I'm happy to answer questions about it, and of course, we're also very, very happy to take suggestions for modifications at the will of the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amato. Are there any questions or comments from committee members? Ms. Sweet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the update on the stakeholders list. I have a motion if no one has any questions, so I can put it on the floor now, unless anybody wants to actually ask anything about the list. Okay.
Seeing none, I would ask that you proceed with presenting that motion.
Okay, so I did submit a motion that reads that the Standing Committee on Alberta Economic Future approve the proposed stakeholders list prepared by Research Services as part of the committee review of the Lobbyist Act, and invite the listed stakeholders and the public to provide written submissions on or before December the 2nd, 2021, notifying those who make submissions that their name and submission may be made public.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sweet. At this point, I would ask if there's any comments or discussion based on the motion before the committee. Anyone online wishing to comment on this motion? Seeing none, I am willing to call the question. In the room, all those in favor of the motion as presented, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, please say no. Online, all those in favor of this motion, please say aye.
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 Anyone online opposed, please say no. Hearing none, this motion is carried. Thank you very much, Ms. Sweet. Next on the agenda is next steps in the review. Honourable members, the committee should now undertake a discussion as to the next steps in our review of the Lobbyists Act. At this stage in other reviews, committees have discussed how they would like to engage stakeholders and receive other feedback, such as public written submissions. At this time, I would like to open the floor to a discussion about how the committee would like to proceed with consultations. We've already agreed to that. Please correction, no. I will correct it. We've already done that. I apologize. We just agreed to the motion from Ms. Sweet, and that was a redundant statement that I read, and I apologize for that. We'll skip down a little bit further to where the committee has chosen to proceed with seeking public consultations. So, honourable members, as the committee has decided to seek written submissions for the public as part of the review of the Lobbyist Act, I would like to invite the Legislative Assembly Office Corporate Communications to provide the committee with an overview of options available for advertising and engaging the public to make submissions. Ms. Janet Laurie on the screen, please. Please provide your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you said, I'm Janet Laurie. I'm representing communication services for the LAO. What we can do from communications is pull together a document that provides the options available to the committee in terms of different strategies, be they paid advertising, low cost, no cost, and that way the committee can review all of those options and determine how they'd like to proceed for if they're proceeding with written submissions in terms of public engagement.
Thank you very much, Ms. Laurie. Are there any questions for Ms. Laurie at this time? Seeing none, I think there is a proposed motion. Mr. Roswell, sorry, I apologize.
I'd like to move that the Standing Committee on Alberta's Economic Future direct Legislative Assembly Office Corporate Communications to develop a low to no cost communication plan to engage in the public in making written submissions to the committee in relations to the review of the Lobbyist Act for the approval by the chair and deputy chair after the committee members have had an opportunity to review it.
I believe this motion will be posted shortly. At this time, are there any comments or questions from any of the committee members on the proposed motion? Online? Oh, sorry, Mr. Billis?
Yeah, my only question, I appreciate that we want to keep costs low, but at the same time, I think we want to ensure that members of the public are aware that we are reviewing this legislation and that they're invited to make submissions. So I appreciate those that are already registered lobbyists will be well aware that this legislation has come up, but I think for private members that it may be important that the LAO develop a robust communication strategy. But I do think, so I'm not speaking opposed to this motion, but especially nowadays with social media and the low cost to advertise through social media, that the LAO could come up with a robust, low cost communication strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Billis. I think that's reasonable, and given the language is subjective to some degree, unless you're wanting to propose an amendment, are you still? Thank you very much for that. Again, anyone online wishing to comment on the proposed motion? Seeing and hearing none, I am prepared to call the question. And thank you again to Mr. Billis for that consideration. I think that is wise, and I would ask the LAO to hear those words within this motion. In the room, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Online, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Thank you. Online, any opposed, please say no. Hearing none, this motion is carried and so ordered. Now, I believe we will be moving to agenda item number 5, a request to present to the committee by the Tourism Industry Association of Alberta. Honourable members, at our September 13th, 2021 meeting, the committee agreed to take up a discussion at today's meeting as to whether it wishes to hear a presentation from the Tourism Industry Association of Alberta in relation to its recently released report, Alberta's Crown Land Outdoor Recreation Economy. At this time, I would like to open the floor to a discussion on the matter. Are there any wishing to speak? Mr. Billis.
Sure. I think I believe this committee has heard from this group in the past. I think it's important to hear from the Tourism Association of Alberta. I think they play a critical role. I think we all understand, some better than others, how the tourism industry has been impacted over the last 2 years due to COVID. But I appreciate the fact that the Tourism Association of Alberta has recently put out a report, and so I think I will put forward a motion that we invite them to come present to us, to give us the opportunity to ask questions. I know I'm very, very interested to hear how they are managing, the pandemic and their plans moving forward, looking at how we can support tourism as an economic diversification tool and a critical element to Alberta's economy. So I'll move that the Standing Committee on Alberta's Economic Future invite the Tourism Association of Alberta to present to the committee at a future meeting on Alberta's Crown Land Outdoor Recreation Economy report as per their request to the chair.
That motion is now up on the screen. Any others wishing to speak to this motion? Anyone online? Seeing and hearing none, I am willing to call the question. To the motion put forward by Member Billis, in the room, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, please say no. Online, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Anyone online opposed, please say no. Hearing none, that motion is carried and so ordered. Thank you, Mr. Billis. Now back to the agenda items. Do any members of the committee have any other business that they would wish to bring forward at this time? Online, last call for any other business. Seeing and hearing none. The date of the next meeting will be at the call of the chair. And at this time, I will adjourn the meeting. If there's nothing else for the consideration of the committee, I will call for a motion to adjourn. Mr. Walker, it's moved by Mr. Walker that the October 21st, 2021 meeting of the Standing Committee on Alberta's Economic Future be adjourned. In the room, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Online, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, please say no. That motion is carried. Thank you, everyone. you.